Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking the gritty, totally complex history of early North America between 1590 and 1675. This is a period completely defined by grand ambitions, profound struggles, and deeply contrasting visions for what this new world should actually be. So let's just jump right in. To really wrap our heads around this era, we've got to start by asking the ultimate question driving all this European expansion across the Atlantic. Were these early settlements built primarily as massive wealth-generating engines, or were they meant to be safe sanctuaries for religious freedom? It's not a simple either-or answer, but as you'll see, how these colonists answered that question profoundly shaped the future of an entire nation.
Here is our roadmap for today. First up, early European claims. Then, England's bumpy start. From there, we'll dig into the two major drivers of colonization, the pursuit of wealth, followed by seeking religious sanctuary. And finally, we'll wrap up with the rebellions and divisions that erupted from those contrasting goals.
Section 1. Early European Claims. Let's look at who was staking claims before England truly made its mark.
It's crazy to think about the massive territories already staked out by rival powers. You've got France stretching way deep into the northern continent, totally driven by a super lucrative fur trading network along the rivers. Then, down south, Spain has this vast, sweeping reach. The truth is, England was actually pretty late to the party, scrambling for a foothold on a continent that was already heavily contested.
Now, Spain's strategy evolved a lot over time. At first, they were absolutely obsessed with finding mythical cities of gold. You had guys like Coronado leading expeditions scouring the southwest but coming up totally empty-handed. When they realized localized treasure wasn't panning out, Spain shifted gears. They started setting up permanent physical settlements, like New Mexico. And a huge part of this transition relied on Franciscan priests. Their mission was to convert native populations to Catholicism, basically integrating religious expansion right alongside imperial control.
But to keep those outposts running, the Spanish relied on a brutal structure known as the encomienda system. The Spanish arrivals definitely weren't planning on working the mines or fields themselves, right? So they compelled Native Americans into forced labor. The absolute tragic reality here is that this system completely failed. Because of horrific conditions and exposure to European diseases, a massive portion of the native workers died. This demographic collapse eventually led colonists to seek out enslaved Africans to feed their endless demand for labor. Moving on to Section 2, England's bumpy start, because their early attempts were definitely a struggle.
So England basically rejects Spain's monopoly over the continent. Back home, they had this enclosure movement displacing poor families, which really pushed wealthy investors to start looking across the Atlantic. Queen Elizabeth gives Walter Raleigh a charter, leading to the first big settlement attempt on Roanoke Island in 1585. But man, it was a disaster. When a resupply ship finally got back there in 1590, the entire colony was just gone, completely deserted. The only clue they found was the word Croatoan carved into a tree. It's a mystery that's still a huge piece of American folklore today. It actually wasn't until 1607 that the English finally managed a permanent foothold at the Jamestown Fort. Founded by the Virginia Company, this place was a rugged, absolutely miserable outpost. The first settlers were pretty inept at basic survival, and they struggled severely with starvation and disease. On top of that, they were constantly clashing with the local Powhatan Indians. The English engaged in warfare, enslaved natives, and confiscated land just to keep this incredibly fragile settlement from totally collapsing.
Section 3. The pursuit of wealth. Let's really unpack those economic motivations.
What literally saved Virginia from total collapse was a plant. Tobacco quickly exploded as a highly profitable cash crop. But here's the catch. Growing tobacco is absolutely grueling work. As profits skyrocketed, the demand for labor went right up with it. At first, Virginians used hired indentured servants from England. But as the need kept growing, they increasingly turned to enslaved Africans. This single crop effectively cemented a labor-intensive agrarian economy right there in the South.
And this wealth-first model spread fast. The Carolinas eventually split, becoming these massive producers of rice, tobacco, and timber. North Carolina was mostly settled by smaller planters trickling down from Virginia. South Carolina, on the other hand, was heavily settled by wealthy planters from the West Indies, and they brought a deeply entrenched pre-existing slave society right along with them. Meanwhile, up north, the English expanded their economic empire with a surprisingly quiet victory. They literally captured the diverse trading hub of New Amsterdam from the Dutch without firing a single shot and renamed it New York.
Even Georgia, the very last British colony, founded by James Oglethorpe, had strategic and economic roots. It was originally designed as a buffer zone to protect the wealthier northern colonies from the Spanish down in Florida, But Oglethorpe also had this highly idealistic vision of creating a haven for England's poor. He wanted a common man's utopia, completely free of slavery. But despite working as a military buffer, that utopian vision totally failed. Pretty soon, Georgia just adopted the exact same plantation economy as its neighbors.
All right, Section 4, Seeking Religious Sanctuary. Let's look at the group searching for a safe haven in the New World. So when King James I took the English throne, he sided heavily with the Anglican Church, which really alienated other Protestant groups. This pushed two very distinct groups of English Calvinists to pack up and flee to America. First, you've got the Pilgrims. They were separatists. They basically believed the Church of England was beyond saving and wanted to start a completely new church from scratch. Then you've got the Puritans. They didn't want to leave the church entirely. They just wanted to purify or reform it from the inside out.
Interestingly, both groups ended up in Massachusetts. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth and notably drafted the Mayflower Compact. This was huge because it ensured they had a viable, functioning government right out of the gate. The Puritans, who settled Massachusetts Bay, actually used their own money to fund their colony. They were incredibly invested in building strong, highly moral communities of really hard workers. They weren't just trying to scrape by, they were actively trying to build a city upon a hill to be a shining success in the eyes of both God and man.
But here's the irony. Sanctuary for one group absolutely did not mean tolerance for others. Take Anne Hutchinson. She was a brilliant, independent thinker who believed God spoke directly to her, completely bypassing the male ministers. Because she stepped way outside traditional women's roles to preach this, she was promptly banished to Rhode Island. Or look at Maryland. It was originally founded as a safe refuge for English Catholics with a strict Religious Toleration Act, but eventually, Puritans took over the local government, ripped up the Toleration Act, and literally banned Catholicism. The persecuted had basically become the persecutors. Section 5. Rebellions and Divisions. Let's see how all this tension finally boiled over.
First off, we have to recognize that the colonies were massively disrupted by pure chaos back in the motherland. In 1642, the English Civil War kicks off. Colonists were forced to pick sides as Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, literally overthrew and executed King Charles I. Cromwell runs a commonwealth for a bit, but eventually the monarchy is restored under Charles II. And what does that mean for America? Well, once Charles II is back on the throne, he wants tighter control. He enacts the Navigation Acts, which heavily restricted colonial trade, just to make sure English merchants got the profits. The era of being left alone was officially over.
Back on American soil, internal colonial tension was skyrocketing. By the late 17th century, strict religious orthodoxy was slipping and church attendance was dropping. This sparked deep anxiety and some seriously violent clashes. Puritans in New England began violently persecuting Quakers, whipping them, cropping their ears, even hanging them just for their beliefs. This horrific intolerance is actually what prompted William Penn to petition the king for land, creating Pennsylvania as a holy experiment. It was specifically designed from the ground up to be a safe haven for Quakers and their core beliefs in equality.
By the late 1600s, this fundamental divide was crystal clear. We're looking at two completely distinct Americas taking shape. On one hand, you've got the southern colonies. Their entire world is characterized by staple cash crops, an increasingly massive enslaved population, and sprawling plantations. Contrast that completely with New England. Up there, society is defined by strict puritanical religion, a lack of those massive cash crops, and an economy built largely on fishing, timber, and merchant trading.
Naturally, all this tension over land, economics, and power was bound to explode. A perfect example of this is Bacon's rebellion in Virginia. You had these landless freemen incredibly frustrated that they couldn't get prime farming land and furious over Native American attacks on the frontier. So they rallied behind Nathaniel Bacon. They actively challenged the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, demanding more land seized from local native tribes and a much bigger voice in the colonial government. Now, the rebellion fizzled out after Bacon died of disease and 23 of his leaders were hanged, but it proved just how explosive the anger of the lower classes had become.
Which leaves us with a lingering, absolutely crucial question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Look at the foundations laid between 1590 and 1675. How did this volatile early mix, the ruthless economic ambition, the rigid and often intolerant religious zeal, and the tragic reliance on forced labor, permanently set the stage for centuries of American history to come? The roots of the nation's greatest triumphs and its deepest, darkest conflicts were literally planted right here. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these fascinating early years.